Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Research America Alliance discussion. I'm Mike Coburn. I'm Executive Vice President of Research America, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today and for your partnership in Research America. Now, if your organization is not a member, I hope you'll shoot an email to our colleague Joel, who's our Director of Membership, who's on standby to help discuss membership with you. So please shoot an email to Joel if you're not a member and would like to learn more. Today, we're joined by Rashi Romanoff, who's the Chief Executive Officer, and Liz Stout, Communications and Public Policy Administrator from the National Association of Veterans Research and Education Foundations. You know, the VA has long been on the forefront of research that's benefited veterans and all of us. As the VA celebrates an extraordinary milestone in its landmark 1 million veteran research initiative, we'll be looking at the incredible research ecosystem responsible for untold medical and public health progress. So as always, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box or in the chat. And again, thank you for joining us. And Liz and Rashi, I'm going to turn the program over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Mike. We're just so excited to be here, and I want to thank the entire Research America team for having us. NAVREF is a new member to Research America, and already in the couple months since we've joined, I know we've already seen all the benefits of being a part of this august group, and we're really excited about building this relationship over time. As Mike mentioned, my name is Rashi Romanoff. I'm the CEO of NAVREF. I just joined the NAVREF team about 6 or 7 months ago. And I know in looking at sort of the attendee list, there's some folks that are very familiar with NAVREF. And so just want to acknowledge that, we're just so excited to be here and so excited to talk about VA research. By way of background, I worked at the VA from 2010 to 2017. So parts of this kind of informed presentation are a little bit about the time there, but then also just really excited to sort of demystify a bit of VA research and just talk about ways that organizations can get more involved and really start to think about opportunities to bring more research opportunities to veterans and their families. You can go to the next slide. So I always find that before we sort of dive into the specifics of research and appropriations and all the legal sort of regulatory frameworks, just starting at a high level to introduce the VA is always really helpful. The VA is the nation's largest integrated healthcare system. It has over 1,200 sites of care, including hospitals, nursing homes, community-based outpatient clinics, specialty care centers. So it's a really large system across the United States. It's in all 50 states. It's also in all the territories. And so it's a really complex, diverse system of healthcare delivery, really in the country itself. One of the things, and I should say outside of healthcare, it also administers, the benefits program. So if you're familiar with the GI Bill or any other kinds of benefits, they also administer the VA cemeteries program. So a really large purview, making it, I think, the second largest agency sort of in the US federal government. One of the things that not a lot of people know is the unique public-private partnership model that VA has really sustained over time. And this is really specifically with the academic medical centers. And a lot of this really got kicked off following World War II, where people came together and said, we really want to make sure that veterans have access to the best and brightest medical minds in our country. And so one of the things that the VA does very uniquely in the federal landscape, from my account, this is the largest public-private partnership model across the US government, but this idea of training the nation's doctors. So if you're a physician and you're on the call, chances are when you were in medical school or in your residency, you did some portion of your clinical training at an affiliated VA medical center. So the VA trains 70% of the nation's doctors, and a lot of times this goes beyond just training. So when specifically you look at research, oftentimes the PIs and the research staff that are leading these initiatives are often duly appointed personnel. So you're not just working at the Durham VA, chances are you have some sort of affiliation at Duke. And so it's a really interesting dynamic, which I think has led to so many great examples of innovation and partnership across the health ecosystem for veterans. You can go to the next slide. So who we serve, the largest integrated healthcare system. So when you think about sort of facts and figures of who the patient population is at the VA, nationwide, there's about 20 million veterans. About half of those are using VA benefits and are receiving some form of VA healthcare. Breaking that down, when you think of traditionally who's served, obviously a higher proportion of that are male veterans, though female veterans comprise about 10%. And female veterans are also the fastest growing subset population of the VA. Very exciting week. I'm sure lots of people on the phone have been tracking the executive order, sort of expanding women's health research. If you sort of dig into the EO language, lots of really interesting authorities directed at or actions directed at the VA as I think the administration is thinking about ways that we can leverage the VA's healthcare system to really dive into the needs of women veterans and research opportunities there. It's a racially diverse system, so we included some of the statistics on that racial diversity as well as the age diversity. As you can sort of imagine, when you think about, foreign policy and, service member history, when Vietnam, Gulf War era, as all of those veterans are aging, they're increasingly seeking out the VA for care. So when you look at sort of across the board, lots of veterans across the VA are a part of an older cohort. And so it's sort of some interesting dynamics as we think about aging, chronic health disease management, and other sort of emerging issues on the healthcare space. So it's a really interesting sort of microcosm health system of sort of the American public health system at large. So the next slide talks a little bit about the VA research program itself. So historically, and I always say the VA research program is 99 years old, doesn't look a day over 98 years old, a little bit of a joke, but it's really the origins of the VA research program really go back to the earliest days of the department itself. And research has really been cemented as a core mission of the department. I always mention the second bullet because, if you've ever heard a Secretary of VA speak, chances are you've heard this, but a lot of folks don't really know that there's been so many healthcare innovations that really had their early day origins at the VA itself. So the nicotine patch, the pacemaker, CT scanner, all these things were invented at the VA. More recently, when you think about innovations related to the electronic medical record, psychedelic treatments for PTSD, again, the VA has really been sort of a test bed for a lot of these different kinds of innovations and has really been a force multiplier and a propeller for medical innovation across the United States. What started as, I think, 3 research programs 100 years ago, now in 2024, over 115 VA medical centers have active research programs. So a really large footprint across the United States, really thinking about opportunities to engage in research. So the next slide starts to talk a little bit about NAVREF and who I am and who Liz is and how we fit into this ecosystem of research. So, when we talk about the research programs and sort of the breadth and scope of VA research, a lot of this is traditionally thinking about intramural research. But in the 80s, Congress came together with the VA and really wanted to make sure that, if there is a phase 3, phase 4 cancer cure drug that's under development and in trials, a veteran who wants to be able to access that should have access to it within the VA system. However, because of very complicated appropriations law, NIH or Johnson & Johnson or Pfizer or, Robert Wood Johnson or Alzheimer's Association, they can't just cut a check over to the VA and say, okay, now go do this research. It's just not allowed given appropriations and how we build the budget. So they came together and they said, what if we were to set up a nonprofit infrastructure which would serve as this flexible funding mechanism? And the whole purpose would be to work with extramural research sponsors to really facilitate and execute research efforts across the VA. So these nonprofits would be responsible for contracting, for budgeting, really the administration of all of these extramural grants. A really, really, innovative, interesting idea about how really to facilitate and fast track some of this activity. So it started as, one nonprofit back in the 80s here in DC. 30 years later has really blossomed into almost 80 VA affiliated nonprofits all across the country. A common question is, well, why are there so many? Why isn't there just one? A few different reasons for it, but the one that I think is sort of the easiest to grasp, given the earlier conversation, is that this partnership and sort of all of the relationships on the ground between the academic affiliate become really, really integral. And so oftentimes the nonprofit is doing a lot of that facilitation, between the Durham VA and Duke, for example. So one of the reasons why there's so many is that, all of the relationships that we have between the academic medical centers is really a force multiplier for innovation and research across the system. And then NAVREF's role in all of this is that we're a membership association. So we represent this network of VA nonprofits. You can go to the next slide. So taken in total across all, I think 78 of these nonprofits, and this is data from FY22, these nonprofits facilitated upwards of $310 million in extramural research across the VA. Sort of putting that in context, because I think sometimes when you hear hundreds of millions of dollars, you don't quite know what that means until you have another number to compare it to. VA's intramural research budget, so what Congress has appropriated for VA to do, focused on research initiatives for VA, is around $890 million. And so this is sort of what makes up the VA research budget, right? Is the opportunities for Congress to be able to appropriate money and say, these are priority areas that VA should focus on, but also this avenue for extramural partners to come in and also provide funding to the VA. So that's sort of the story of how VA research is funded. The next slide includes a map, and we have a link, which I think Liz can put into the chat. If you're interested in figuring out, when we say almost 80 sites, I know people are like, oh, so where are these located? As you can see, they're located all across the country. I should say it's not necessarily a one-to-one. So oftentimes one of the nonprofits might be serving multiple VA medical centers. And so it's sort of a complicated dynamic, but if you go online, you can click on our website and take a look at the directory and you'll get an understanding. So the natural next question is, okay, 310 million, where's that money coming from? So the next slide includes a little bit of data on who is really funding extramural research at the VA. And this is all a part of a report that VA provides to Congress every year. As you can see on the left, NIH, private sector, increasingly DoD, really the main fuelers and funders of extramural research funding. And one of the things that NAVREF is always seeking to do is find other kinds of organizations that might be interested in coming to the VA, given the unique patient population that we have. The pie chart on the right, I always like to include the sort of main takeaway here, and it's sort of a little bit of a secret for I think, for NAVREF, but NAVREF does have an E in our acronym. So we're the National Association of Veterans Research and Education Foundations. 99% of this 310 million has really been focused on clinical research trials. And I think, that's been the bread and butter. And that's really the origins of why these nonprofits exist. However, I always sort of pause to talk about education. Less than 1% of this work has really focused on education. And maybe perhaps it's because I'm new. I feel like the opportunities around education are really, really, really exciting across the VA. So in the 90s, Congress sort of authorized these nonprofits to also accept funding to educate and train VA healthcare staff, veterans, and family members. So there's really a huge amount of flexibility that the nonprofits have. And so, if any of your organizations are thinking about healthcare provider training or, patient education, caregiver support, just a lot of opportunities to think about ways that the nonprofits could really be supporting some of those efforts. So the next slide, and then like this next bunch of slides, I think I can go through pretty quickly. So, why do research at the VA? And since NAVREF is sort of positioned with thinking about ways to encourage more people to do research at the VA, what I always say, and this isn't on the slide, but I think it's important to sort of pause and underscore, is that in general, in the 15 years that I've been working in the military veteran space, there's an incredible amount of goodwill of organizations wanting to support veterans. So more than any business reason for doing research or timelines or revenue or any of that, I really do have to say, I think almost more than any other cause in the country, helping veterans, helping service members, those that have served our country. This is a mission that I'm very humbled to represent, but it's something that I find that a lot of organizations recognize we owe it to service members and veterans to bring them these cures, to bring them these innovative treatments. And so, frankly, I always tell people this isn't really like a sell, but there are, beyond just sort of the goodwill, warm and fuzzy reasons, a lot of reasons to do research at the VA. So, as I mentioned, it's the largest integrated healthcare system. There's a single EMR system across all 9 million patients. The diversity that you get at the VA is quite impressive, sort of, especially as you're thinking about the new FDA guidelines that are sort of requiring more diverse populations to be included in clinical trial opportunities. It's a relatively study naive population, and we say that because it's not a system that if you've gone into, there's patients that are, and we'll sort of talk about this on the next slide, but in some systems, patients are frequently approached about participating in clinical research trials. Overall, that's not really the case at the VA. It's also a highly altruistic and motivated population. So things like the Million Veteran Program, veterans want to participate in trials because there's a sense of community, and they want to participate not only to improve their own health, but also to, I think, improve the knowledge base so that other veterans down the line can also benefit from research. And so there's been a lot of research on this, sort of showing that veterans are actually more likely to participate in clinical trials. And Mike, I know this is something that we've talked a lot about Research America with, because since you were doing so much polling around attitudes and perceptions of clinical trials, just want to underscore that it might be of interest to this group. It's an established healthcare system. It's almost 100 years old, proven track record of success. And then this final point, frankly, this is really what attracted me to joining the VA and sort of entering this space when I was much younger and out of grad school. This idea that, when you're doing research at the VA, you're getting published, and it's not just going to sit in a journal article somewhere. More than half of, VA researchers are also clinicians. So I always get nervous ever saying that government is fast or they can do things quickly. It is still a bureaucracy, and I recognize that. But one of the things that I think is really exciting about the VA system is because you have this overlap of researchers and clinicians, we are able to see research progress pretty quickly from the research setting to care delivery, which I think is really exciting. However, despite all of this, as you'll see on the next slide, there's this gulf, right? So despite all the reasons to do it, the goodwill, the data, the size of the population, less than 5% of clinical research trials are offered at the VA. And so this is really one of NAVREF's rallying cries, is what can we do to bring more high quality trials to veterans by streamlining the process, by increasing the efficiency, and supporting our members so that we have a really rich ecosystem at the VA. The next slide talks a little bit about some of the progress that's been made. And I often share this slide with our industry partners because it usually underscores some of the things that the VA has done to expedite the process. So things like a dedicated group of attorneys. VA's established the STAR Attorney Group, which is really focused on working with industry sponsors to improve veterans' access to clinical trials. And this is on the next slide if you want to advance. They've looked at things like standard industry contracts and master CRADAs and master CDAs. So if you're an industry partner going in and you've done one project at Charleston and now you want to do something in, New York City, it's not as if you necessarily have to start all the way from the beginning on the legal agreement. You could pursue sort of a master CRADA, master CDA, so that one agreement could help sort of open up the doors across the VA system. So you're getting a little bit less of this, like, okay, I've been to one VA, at least a couple of things to standardize that process. A few years ago, VA also began accepting commercial IRBs, huge ways of being able to expedite and bring in more trials. They've also launched a partnered research program office, which is really aimed at streamlining startup activities for multi-site trials. They have a little bit of a narrow focus. They just launched this office a few years ago. It's still sort of getting stood up. So we work really, really closely with the PRP. But I mention all of these things because there's VA recognizes, when I say less than 5% of clinical trials are offered there, it's not an indictment of the VA. We're big partners of the VA. The VA wants to improve this. And so there's a track record of them thinking about their processes and thinking about how they can better set things up so that it's easier for folks to come in and do research. And this is an area of continuous improvement and ongoing dialogue. I know for NAVREF, we have consortium models. If you all have ideas, this is something we're always eager to sort of dive into. The next slide just talks a little bit about us. So, we are really focused on supporting those 78 sites across the country that are doing this work on the ground and working with the VA locally. So we provide training, we provide core services. We're always thinking about what our members need to really be able to foster more of these research and education partnerships. And then we do a lot of collaboration with external entities to really expand clinical research opportunities at the VA. The last slide that I think we have is on FOVA, and I actually want to turn it over to Liz to do a quick shout out to FOVA, because I think this might be something that some of the folks on the phone might want to get involved with. So Liz, I'll let you cover this one.
Yeah, so NAVREF now proudly chairs the Friends of VA Medical Care and Health Research, which is FOVA, the FOVA Coalition, and it's made up of more than 80 national academic, medical, and scientific societies, health and patient advocacy groups, and of course, veteran focus associations. And of course, we're so thrilled that Research America has recently joined as well. FOVA mainly advocates for appropriation funding for the VA's medical and prosthetic research program, along with infrastructure needs such as major and minor construction and IT. We just released our FY25 request on our new website, which I'll drop in the chat. You can go to the next slide, please. So there's many ways that you can support FOVA and veterans research initiatives. So if this is something you think your organization would be interested in joining, please feel free to reach out.
Thanks, Liz. And, I should say FOVA it's free to join. The requirements around it, we have quarterly town halls. We try to, because the focus is on research appropriations, we're always trying to just keep people sort of in the loop and in the know on what's going on. These days, though, I will say it feels like a bit of a, who knows what's going on with the CR and budget these days. Mike, you might know better than I do. But for those of you that might have sort of a specific interest on clinical research and the VA, reach out to us. And in general, I would say, when in doubt, and I think the Q&A will hopefully get into this, I always tell people, we might not have an answer to everything or the solution to everything, but I really, as I see it, 7 months into this opportunity, one of the things NAVREF can do really, really effectively is sort of serve as a connector, right? So if there's something you're interested around VA research, being able to connect the dots either locally on the ground with some of our members, with our partners at VA, with the Office of Research and Development over there, it's all about sort of just enhancing the healthcare quality for our veterans and their family members. So really, really excited to sort of get into Q&A, and here's our emails and things like that if anyone has questions.
Well, Rashi and Liz, thank you for such a great overview of the VA health system and the research that's taking place. Really a lot learned here in this short period of time. And, in that, there are some questions that, I think we can bring forward that come out of your conversation. So as you would know or imagine, many of our Alliance members are involved in research at universities or in industry. And if they want to include veterans in their research projects, how would you advise they get involved?
Absolutely. So on this one, I always, there's a lot of different ways that you can go about including veterans in clinical trials. So there's avenues through industry-sponsored trials. There's, things that I know philanthropy and others are sort of thinking about when it comes to approaches to inclusion of veterans. I would say reach out to NAVREF. Kind of getting back to us being a sort of connector of sorts. One of our function is sort of it's a centralized point of access. So we're able to streamline, coordination, communication across various stakeholders. So like a really clear example is, for example, if you have a clinical, like a funding opportunity for a new clinical research trial, pretty much every day we're sending these out. So one of the benefits, I think, of being a nonprofit, a 501c3, we're not government. We partner with government, but we are independent. So as we get those opportunities, we're able to just go ahead and every day we're sending out clinical trial opportunities for our sites and for PIs that might be interested to come in and apply. So, for those kinds of things, we've got processes in place. if you're an organization, and we've done this a lot with, places like the Prostate Cancer Foundation, which obviously when you look at VA's population, the age, the demographics, the prevalence of prostate cancer, it's a huge sort of area of alignment between a disease state organization and the VA. That's a really great opportunity where, coming to the VA, coming to NAVREF, being able to talk about, well, this is something that we want to do. These are sort of our goals and our strategies of how we want to bring cures to patients that are suffering from these diseases. We're happy to sort of be those facilitators of those conversations and try to connect the dots across the VA. And we do this often, especially I think given the aging issues of veterans and some of the things that are coming up, whether it's cancer, women's health, anything that you sort of read in the news has an impact. We're always happy to get on calls and just sort of figure out what you're trying to do and see if we can't connect you. So definitely reaching out to us is a great first step.
Well, it's terrific, and we won't forget that. You mentioned earlier about changing some processes and getting more clinical trials to veterans. Can you talk a little bit about the processes that you've changed that can help deliver more than the number of clinical trials that you're seeing now in the veteran system?
Yeah, I would say so. The process piece is hard because it's the one thing about the VA is that it's not a centralized, it has an integrated system, but that old adage, you've been to one VA, you've been to one VA, can be kind of challenging. I always push back on that because I'm always like, well, if you talk to one veteran, you talk to one veteran. So I don't necessarily ascribe to full standardization across the system. But again, there are a lot of things that VA has done to try to, standardize what some of this looks like and at least bring a level of predictability so that if you're trying to do research at one site and another site, the system doesn't feel completely foreign. So things like, the dedicated group of attorneys has been a huge thing that has helped sort of standardize the process. It's not just getting lost in sort of a general counsel. You've got attorneys that are dedicated specifically to doing this industry-sponsored trial work. The commercial IRBs is something that we hear all the time of a huge time saver of VA being able to accept these and not having limitations around the kinds that they accept. And I think they're constantly sort of looking at different sorts of commercial IRBs that they can accept, and that list is expanding and growing, which is great. I would do a big push around master legal agreements. There's been a history of doing these a lot with industry sponsors, and I think there's an opportunity to explore doing this with all different kinds of partners. It's just, as you can imagine, like being able to go into a VA and say, oh, well, we actually already have, we've already gone through this process of vetting a long legal document with your attorneys, and now it's just a matter of customizing it for this site, can really be things that save time. And I know, as we've been talking beyond industry partners with groups like, the Prostate Cancer Foundation or Alzheimer's Association, I think I saw earlier that someone from PCORI is a part of Research America. These are groups that, in the nonprofit space are doing a ton of work across the VA through the nonprofits. And we're always looking for ways to streamline that experience. So it doesn't have to feel like, oh, I'm doing things with this VA and this VA and this VA, but you can have a little bit more of a holistic and comprehensive strategy to how you're really thinking about veteran inclusion in your research opportunities.
Well, actually, thanks for that. And also shout out to our member, PCORI. We've worked with PCORI closely, and they've been a great member of Research America. It's great to hear the relationship you have there. You and Liz and your colleagues see a lot of the research that's going on. Are there some projects within the VA research system that you're incredibly excited about, things that you've seen?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm really, really excited about is the Million Veteran Program. And this was something that it got started almost 10, 15 years ago. When I was working at VA previously, they were doing so much around recruitment of getting as many veterans as possible. And really, it's a program that's all about advancing precision healthcare by learning how, someone's genetic background can really, and their military experience and their exposures have impacts on their health and wellness and sort of the long term. Very interesting. Last fall, the Million Veteran Program sort of they met their initial goal, and they enrolled their 1 millionth veteran last November. So it's now one of the world's largest genetic databases. I just saw a percentage, or I saw MVP, what it's called, MVP present, and they said it's also the largest genetic database of individuals of African descent. So when we think about sort of the diversity that the VA has, and I think just the power of precision medicine, that sort of feels like the next frontier of medicine, and knowing that VA could really be at the forefront, whether it's Parkinson's, cholesterol, COVID-19, diabetes, so many applications around genetic medicine. So that's one that I think I've been really excited about. And as we're thinking about how to build that cohort, how to make some of that data accessible, all the questions that I think come up as we're thinking about the MVP program, that's something that's really exciting. The second one that I would say is some of the emerging PTSD treatments and interventions. So things like the psychedelic treatments that did a lot of pioneering work across the VA. When you think about sort of the veteran population, incidents of PTSD and other mental health disorders, it's really, really interesting to think of different kinds of interventions that could better support veterans, especially when you think, veterans are also living in rural areas. So the access to different kinds of treatments is really, really important. And I think a really good example, the last sort of area I would say is anything related to traumatic brain injury. Given what we know happens with service-connected wounds and illnesses, given blast injuries, there was a lot of media coverage on this over the weekend. This is really an area, the bigger story that I love telling about VA research is that when you invest in VA research, you're not just improving the life of a veteran, you're improving American public health. Because whatever we learn in the VA, absolutely, like the nicotine patch didn't just help veterans who were smoking, that had an applicability across the United States healthcare system, across the global healthcare system. The TBI work is another, everything we learn about TBI in veterans goes on to inform, helmet design for kids learning how to ride bikes. So this connective thread and storytelling around leveraging the VA to learn more and to advance American public health, I think is a story that's not told enough. And in these specific pockets, cancer care, psychedelics, mental health, TBI, I think there's just so much potential to really expand and advance the needle.
That's terrific. And I'm taking up all the time here. I have one more question because we do mutual work and advocacy, but as an advocacy organization, what are some of your current priorities for Congress, particularly as they work on this budget that we want to see get moved forward?
Yes, the budget is definitely, even today in like this CR land that it seems that we've permanently begun to occupy in Washington, funding is definitely a huge, huge priority. It's really important for VA and for the Office of Research and Development to have the resources that it needs to be able to execute. As much as we are excited about extramural research, just getting funding from the external entities doesn't make the whole machine run. We need things like IT and infrastructure and space and facilities, and the budget story is really, really critical. One of the things that, research is not in that sort of essentials bucket. So one thing I would note is that anytime one of these CR issues come up, PIs across the country are having to reevaluate, think about what's going to happen to their research. It's really not the environment, to put clinical research, clinical care providers in. And so, the budget shortfalls and really saying we're going to invest in this in a real way and not this dance that I think we do in government sometimes of like the will we, won't we. There's real implications around strategic planning. And I think the needs of veterans and their families is way too important for this to sort of end up being a political football. And so I wish there was a bit more of a dedication to doing it right in this community for the purposes of healthcare. But that's sort of my 2 cents on that piece. And then I would also just say, I think anything around, these innovative healthcare therapies is also really, really exciting. So anything that leverages VA really as a test bed for American public health, I think is something that we're always interested in. Because again, I think people just don't, half of the calls that I do like this are people are like, oh, I didn't know VA really did research like that. So anytime we can leverage legislation to sort of tell that story, we're always excited to.
Great. Well, I'm going to ask my colleague Jacqueline to join us. We've had some questions come in during the conversation. So Jacqueline, I'll yield to you.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks, Rashi and Liz. This has been a fantastic discussion so far. We have a lot of audience questions, so I'll go in order as they came in. I hope we can get to most of them. So our first question, should more academic medical centers seek to partner with VA hospitals for multi-centric clinical trials?
So I would say yes, and there's a rich tradition of the academic medical centers working with the VA. You know, a few years ago, I believe in 2020, GAO actually did a report on this saying, you know, how are decisions being made when, you know, how are the academics and the nonprofits sort of working together on research efforts? And I think one of their recommendations was there's an ability to do a lot more. And, you know, there's the report itself goes into frameworks and decision tools and all sorts of details. But I think absolutely, especially, and it really does depend, I should say, on the kind of research you're doing. So like, for example, given the demographics of who VA is serving, if you've got an academic medical center leading, you know, pediatric research, maybe not the best application of leveraging the VA for that. But I do think in these areas of priority for the VA around aging, around cancer care, TBI, mental health, behavioral health, huge opportunities to leverage the patient population at the VA. And I think a huge willingness from these research programs to do more with the academic affiliate. And so we're always, you know, AAMC is one of NAVREF's biggest partners, and we're always thinking about ways that we can be collaborating and sort of, I think, shining a light. I think one thing NAVREF, VA, sort of we can be doing better is lifting up the stories where it works, because there's so much good that's happened when the academic and the VA is sort of all working together on research, including veterans in these opportunities, being able to use it as to sort of build up their value proposition. I think so much can be achieved. And so absolutely, that would be my yes answer on that one.
Great, makes perfect sense. So our next question, how would researchers find labs or research efforts more directly working towards VA need, especially specific topics such as the psychiatric and psychology field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a very good question. You know, on the NAVREF website, we have one of our directory documents includes, you know, at each site sort of what their specialty focus areas are, and there's sort of a bulleted list for each page. So that can be a starting point. The one caveat I'll say, just being very transparent, I think a challenge of the VA, and this is frankly, I think same sort of regardless of where you go, but people move around. So at one point, as we were thinking about how NAVREF could best distribute opportunities, you know, something that had come up was, well, should we just send it to those sites that we know have an oncology, you know, research effort? And I think the reason we don't really do that, the reason we send it out widely is because PIs move around, and because there's so many students and the graduate students sort of in and out of the system, it's hard to sort of say, oh, well, like this is the hub for this. Now there are centers for excellence, and there's definitely like established hubs for different specific focus areas, which feel free to reach out and we can kind of help connect the dots there. But I will say because the talent moves around a lot, it's not necessarily like fixed in place, like, oh, if you're interested in psychedelics, go to San Diego. If you're interested in TBI, go to Boston. I think you'll find that on some of these high priority areas, pockets of research are happening all across the system, which can make it challenging if you're on the outside trying to navigate, but I think also kind of shows the potential you have for lots of different kinds of projects and for PIs.
Great, thank you, good to know. So our next question, are there focus areas for the new research agenda around women's health needs? For example, maternal mortality among African American women, which is an important agenda.
So as I understand it, I don't know that VA has necessarily been tasked with like specific things within the EO. I know that there was a lot around, one of the main things that I know Liz and I were really excited about was VA was directed to look at retention, recruitment of women veterans in clinical research trials, which is a really huge focus area for us. However, absolutely, I think they might have called out, I want to say menopause, fertility as specific areas in the EO itself. But I think given the newness of that, I think they're still sort of figuring out how best to interpret that and how to implement it. So I think probably more to come from VA on how they're going to prioritize, how they're going to do this. One of the things I will say from the NAVREF perspective is while we're urging VA to fund more women's health research, internally through appropriations and with other partners, this is also an area where a lot of the extramural research could be amplified across the VA. So, for example, like while I'm very excited for VA to fund, toxic exposure research on fertility and looking at the impacts and linkages, I also think I'm very focused on what are the clinical research trials that are ongoing that are out there that we could be bringing so that more women veterans are able to participate in that. So it's an exciting moment. I think people are still looking through it and sort of figuring out how they're going to tackle it, especially because it's across different agencies.
Right. Very interesting. Thank you. And I think I have time for one more question. So some of us are familiar with working with the Henry M. Jackson Foundation to connect external funding to military medical research. NAVREF seems like a bit of an analog to that, but doesn't seem to be as directly involved in the research. How would you compare the two entities?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So we work closely with Henry Jackson. I just met with them a couple weeks ago. So it is a bit of an analog. I think the main difference is that we have these 78 sites because at the end of the day, the VA has hundreds of academic affiliates that they're working on the ground with. So kind of going back to that question of well, why aren't you just one NPC? Why are there 78? One of the biggest sort of differentiators between NAVREF and the Henry Jackson Foundation is that we sort of represent these 78 sites because across the network, the academics, the VA are all working together on these individual research projects. And so I sort of bigger picture, maybe it's because I worked at the VA, I'm sort of it's not unlike the dynamics of VA and DoD writ large, in which DoD, everything tends to be centralized and there's one process, obviously I don't want to oversimplify it across the lines of service. There's obviously variations and that's its own sort of bag of things to figure out. But in general, that kind of I think is a bit of a microcosm of VA in general, and that VA is very decentralized with all the different sites of care. And it's always a bit of that push and pull of how much do we centralize? How much do we allow our sites to be independent, which is a bit of a philosophical discussion, but I think is one that has become really interesting as healthcare is evolving and people are thinking about more centralization of service. So it's a really good question. I did want to, if I know we're at the end of the time, I did just want to respond to, I think it was Thomas Sampieri's question about Section 208. This is something that we are very actively involved with. So I'd love to, if you're interested in this, please reach out. One of the things that I think has emerged, and for those of you that might have been involved in the Viper Act, it will feel very, very similar. It's a bit of a Groundhog Day situation for those of us that were involved in that. Essentially, there's this emerging issue around all of the conflicts of interest statutes. So Section 209, Section 208, there's sort of a number of them. And essentially all of these conflict of interest statutes that apply to duly appointed personnel, sort of wanting to disclose if I'm applying for a grant, I'm dual hatted at the VA and the academic affiliate, is there a conflict of interest there? Unfortunately, there's been some new interpretations of Section 208, which would have really far-reaching implications across the VA because of the high volume of duly appointed personnel that they have. And so some new interpretations are coming out and saying, okay, every researcher who's duly appointed would have to submit a waiver and the government attorneys would have to sign off on it. Just a huge administrative burden that VA is very concerned about. Lawyers are very concerned. It would add a huge amount of bureaucratic headache to this system. And honestly, I think stall research from launching at the VA, and B, sort of dissuade researchers from coming to the VA. So NAVREF is doing a lot of really active work on this front to do everything we can to put a pause on this, because I think, and this is me personally, I think that everything that we that has been established with the public-private partnership, the tradition of the academic medical center and VA's origins on providing high-quality care really need to be taken into account before sort of applying conflict of interest statutes that might not necessarily apply to, I think, this rich tradition that we have of medicine across the VA. So apologies, I know we're out of time, but I just wanted to squeeze in my answer on that. And if you're interested in learning more about it, please don't hesitate to reach out to Liz, as we're doing a lot on that front.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Jacqueline, for joining us with the questions. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's question, but I think you have the information to reach out to Rashi and Liz, and please do. First of all, we thank you, Rashi and Liz, for joining us. Learned so much. My takeaways are many from this conversation. So thank you for sharing. And thanks our audience for joining us to learn more about the work of the VA system and research. Before you go, if you're a Research Alliance member, we have an opportunity for you next week. Our members-only Alliance meeting on March 26th at noon is an off-the-record meeting with Eric Fatimi, who's one of the most knowledgeable folks in town about what's going on Capitol Hill. He's a principal at Cornerstone Government Affairs. So that's for members of our Alliance. Join us next week, the 26th at noon. Obviously, we're all focused on the FY25 funding, and there's a lot of other relevant R&D issues that are on the plate here, including this and the Martin framework. Email Jacqueline if for the registration link. Of course, we'll be sending that out again. But it'll be very good sharing information with you that will be up to date, because who knows what's happening between now and then. Well, thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you all have a great day and look forward to seeing you on a future Alliance discussion. Have a great day.
Thank you.